Imagine a secret so explosive that the very people demanding its release suddenly went silent once they realized what was inside. A mystery so tangled in politics and power that those who built their careers screaming transparency are now doing everything possible to hide the truth. That's exactly what's unfolding behind the scenes of the Epstein files, records once hailed as the ultimate proof of corruption now buried under layers of redactions, excuses, and silence. Because what started as a war cry for exposure has turned into a desperate effort to protect someone they never expected to be exposed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's go through the history of the Epstein files. During the Biden administration, this was cause celeb number one for the extreme MAGA right, that there was some massive conspiracy to hide Democratic political involvement in Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking ring. It was promoted and perpetuated by Kash Patel and Dan Bongino over and over and over again. It is probably the #1 conspiracy theory on the online MAGA right. And it was pushed and pushed and pushed that they had to release the files, they should release the files, and Donald Trump was asked on the campaign trail, should the Jeffrey Epstein files be released? And he said yes. Donald Trump comes into office, and Pam Bondi releases a small portion of the Epstein files that had primarily already been public. There's an uproar on the right and by many, many members of Congress about why the Epstein files were not being released. Pam Bondi says, she writes a memo or an email saying that she wants an explanation for why there aren't more files that are released within 24 hours and that within 2 weeks she intends to release them. Then the FBI spends tens of thousands of hours going through the files to redact them. Redact, obviously, what you would need to redact, which is the identification information and any other information about the victims. That lasts a couple months. All of a sudden, it goes quiet. It goes quiet. Suddenly, Congresswoman Luna and others who have been pushing so aggressively for the Epstein files to be released decide we're going to stay quiet. And all of a sudden, they're not released. Well, what do we learn next? Oh, we learn, actually, this whole right-wing conspiracy theory is BS. It is bogus, and Donald Trump is in the Epstein files. So now, all of a sudden, the Republicans who were so aggressively intent on releasing the Epstein files because they were going to be a huge, explosive story about Democrats involved with Jeffrey Epstein are quiet. So the irony of these Republicans accusing the Democrats now of only being interested in this is for political purposes is so thick that it is almost sucking us into the quicksand. But let's go a step further. Let's go a step further. Because now the cover-up is getting so deep and so intense that this committee, which has oversight over the Department of Justice and would ordinarily be the one that is doing this investigation, is running away from it. Why? Because Chairman Comer is the useful idiot who will do the cover-up for Donald Trump. And what does that mean? Oh, well, now there is an oversight investigation, but you know what they're not asking for?
Those kind of comments, and he knows that. Gentleman's recognized.
Now, the oversight committee is doing an investigation, but you know what they're not asking for? You know what you did not put in the rule to confirm that investigation? We're not asking for the documents that were used to open the investigation, who provided the information. They're not asking for witness statements, victim witness statements. They're not asking for recordings that may exist. They're not asking for any of the evidence that might include Donald Trump. And rather than acknowledge that you're just trying to cover up for Donald Trump's knowledge and involvement in the Jeffrey Epstein scheme, you're trying to accuse us of being interested. And there's one more point that I will say quickly. This conspiracy theory that you pushed for years is bogus. And when it comes out to the American people that it is bogus, then they will know that all of your other conspiracy theories are also bogus, and your credibility is nil. And I yield back.
When the story first broke, the movement around the Epstein files became a kind of obsession. Online figures, lawmakers, and influencers built entire audiences on the promise that these documents would reveal an unimaginable scandal involving some of the most powerful people in the world. It wasn't just politics, it was a crusade. Hashtags, live streams, and talk show rants all demanded one thing: release the files. They claimed the truth was being buried by those in power, that there was a coordinated cover-up to protect certain political elites. Names like Kash Patel and Dan Bongino repeated that narrative again and again, turning it into the heartbeat of online outrage. It was easy to rally people around the idea that shadowy figures were protecting each other while victims were ignored. The energy was intense, the story unstoppable, and the target was clear, or at least it seemed that way. The rallying cry was release the files and expose them all, but when that moment finally arrived, the tone changed in an instant. When the administration shifted, a new team promised to finally open those boxes to show the world what the previous leadership had supposedly hidden. One of the key figures, Pam Bondi, even announced a partial release. For a brief moment it felt like the long-awaited truth was finally within reach. A few documents dropped, nothing earth-shattering, mostly what had already leaked years before, but it was enough to ignite hope among believers that the real bombshells were next. Then came the confusion. Behind closed doors, the FBI was working around the clock, spending thousands of hours going line by line through the material, redacting details tied to victims and witnesses. Those redactions were standard procedure, the kind of careful editing needed to protect identities. But that process stretched on for months, and then something strange happened. The people who had spent years demanding transparency suddenly went silent. Members of Congress who had built reputations on demanding those files, people like Rep. Luna and others, stopped talking about it altogether. The hashtags disappeared. The online fury dimmed. That silence was deafening. What could make an entire movement that obsessed over this case suddenly drop it overnight? The answer, according to investigative reports and insiders who'd seen portions of the material, was buried inside those very files. Once investigators started connecting dots, it became clear that the story wasn't what many had been told. The promised scandal pointing to one side of the political spectrum began to crumble, and that's when an unexpected name surfaced, one that flipped the entire narrative upside down. Suddenly the same people who had been shouting for justice were backpedaling, refusing to push further, pretending as if the crusade had never existed. The calls for truth turned into calls for silence. That's when Representative Dan Goldman stepped in during a tense congressional hearing and dropped what can only be described as a political earthquake. He looked directly at the committee chair and called him, quote, a useful idiot, a man protecting someone powerful instead of doing his duty to the public. His message was blunt: this wasn't oversight, this was a cover-up. The same committee that should have been leading the charge for transparency was now refusing to even request key evidence. They weren't asking for the witness statements, they weren't asking for the recordings that might exist, they weren't asking for the redacted details that could prove who knew what and when. Instead they were playing defense, building a wall of silence around the very investigation they once weaponized. The hypocrisy wasn't just political, it was staggering. Goldman laid it out piece by piece. For years, he said, right-wing media had built an empire on the promise of exposing Epstein's connections to powerful Democrats. They pushed the idea of a secret list, a hidden network, a set of files that would prove everything they'd been saying for years. But when their own side came under scrutiny, suddenly transparency was no longer convenient. The outrage vanished overnight. That moment peeled back something much deeper than a single scandal. It showed how conspiracy politics really works. It's not about truth, it's about usefulness. The Epstein story became a tool, a weapon to attack opponents, never a sincere effort to seek justice for victims or hold anyone accountable. It was outrage by design, built to manipulate emotion, loyalty, and fear. And once the weapon turned inward, the same people who had screamed for exposure scrambled to bury it. The Oversight Committee, which holds the legal power to demand those documents, quietly avoided doing so. No subpoenas for the key witnesses, no questions about how the files were redacted, no investigation into why certain records were withheld. It wasn't incompetence, it was self-protection. If they asked too many questions, the answers might have hit too close to home. Think about that for a second. A scandal that was supposed to shake Washington to its core ended up exposing something far worse than anyone expected. Not a single guilty party, but a system where outrage itself is a political product. Every accusation, every viral headline, every breaking claim was built for clicks and control, not clarity. And this is where the story gets even darker. The same figures who built the initial outrage machine never retracted their claims. They simply pivoted to new targets. One day it's release the files, the next it's a brand new villain or theory to keep the audience angry. It's a self-feeding cycle. Outrage, distraction, repeat. The truth becomes irrelevant because outrage pays better. When Goldman confronted the committee, you could feel the discomfort in the room. Lawmakers who had once shouted about Epstein's crimes suddenly couldn't look up from their notes. The moment he said the quiet part out loud, that this cover-up was protecting someone inside their own circle, the silence was chilling. Not a single person challenged the details. They just shifted topics, tried to change the subject, and moved on. This wasn't just about one name in a document, it was about credibility, or the loss of it. If the same people who claim to stand for justice and transparency turn away the moment the mirror faces them, what does that say about everything else they've been selling to the public? When one conspiracy collapses, it drags the rest down with it. Goldman's final words hit like a punch. He said that when the American people finally see how false this story was, they'll realize how many other theories from the same crowd were built the same way, half-truths, edited outrage and strategic omission. And when that realization comes, he said their credibility will be gone. That line hung in the air like a warning. What makes this moment so revealing isn't just the hypocrisy, it's what it exposes about how information is weaponized. You take a real scandal like Epstein, full of pain, corruption and unanswered questions, and you twist it until it serves a political goal. Victims become props, facts become optional, outrage becomes entertainment. And the people driving it count on the public being too divided or too exhausted to notice. That's why this story matters so much more than just who appears in a set of documents. It's a cautionary tale about how truth itself gets buried, not by government censors but by the same voices screaming about censorship. It's about power, it's about narrative control, and it's about the price of loyalty in a system that rewards outrage over honesty. The most dangerous part. Once the public realizes that the people they trusted were using them, the entire outrage machine risks collapsing. That's why this investigation has suddenly become radioactive. No one wants to touch it. Not the politicians who built their careers on the Epstein story. Not the commentators who milked it for views. Not the committees that once promised justice. They all know the same thing now. Digging deeper means turning the lens inward. This kind of selective outrage isn't new, but what's different now is how exposed it's become. The internet never forgets. Every deleted tweet, every speech demanding transparency, every viral rant is still out there. And now every one of those voices is silent when it comes to the full release of the files. The very silence they once condemned is now their own strategy. Behind the scenes, investigators and reporters still pushing for transparency say the redacted files contain more than names, they show patterns, contacts, travel records, donations, communications that reveal who benefited and who looked the other way. It's not about proving one party innocent or guilty, it's about accountability across the board. But accountability doesn't sell as well as outrage. So the story gets rewritten, repackaged or ignored altogether. And yet the truth always finds cracks to slip through. Whispers leak out, insiders talk off record, patterns emerge. The same people once shouting about protecting the victims are now dodging basic questions about evidence. The same voices demanding sunlight are now building thicker curtains. Every new excuse adds another layer to the cover-up. What this shows, beyond any partisan line, is that corruption thrives in silence. Every time a politician says, "We can't comment because of an ongoing investigation," what they often mean is, "We can't risk what you'll find." That's why hearings like this one matter. That's why voices like Goldman's, whether you agree with his politics or not, serve a purpose. They force the uncomfortable questions back into the light. And here's the part that most people miss: this entire saga isn't just about what's in the files, it's about how easily the public can be manipulated. One side crafts a narrative, the other side reacts, and both end up playing into the same script. The outrage machine doesn't care who it destroys as long as it keeps the audience engaged. That's the trap. Every time someone online says they're hiding the truth, they're often echoing someone else's talking point, someone who benefits from keeping the real truth buried. And when that truth edges too close to the wrong names, the machine simply moves on. Another scandal, another headline, another distraction. But here's what makes this particular moment different: people are starting to notice. The silence is too obvious, the contradictions too blatant. The same faces that once promised to drain the swamp are now neck-deep in the same murky water they swore to expose. The Epstein files were supposed to prove corruption existed somewhere else. Instead, they've exposed how deep it runs everywhere. As viewers, it's tempting to see this as just another Washington fight, another viral clip that fades by morning. But this one deserves attention because it speaks to something bigger: the danger of letting outrage replace evidence, and emotion replace accountability. Every time we allow politicians or media figures to dictate what version of the truth we get, we hand over a little more of our own judgment. And when an entire movement goes silent after demanding justice, that silence says more than any statement ever could. The question isn't just who's in the Epstein files anymore, it's who's afraid of them. Because when you strip away the politics, what's left is the one thing power always fears most: the truth that doesn't serve anyone's agenda. So maybe the lesson here is simpler than it looks. Don't believe the outrage until you've seen the evidence. Don't trust the ones who only shout when it benefits them. And never ever let silence be the final word in a story that was supposed to expose everything. Because if this scandal proves anything, it's that transparency isn't about who you expose, it's about whether you're willing to expose everyone, even your own. The louder someone demands the truth about others while hiding their own, the clearer their motives become. And that's where we are now. A movement built on the promise of shining light has turned into a shadow it can't escape. The people who once claimed to be fighting corruption have become the very thing they warned about. And the American public is left asking the one question no one in power seems eager to answer: what are they so afraid of us seeing? If you found this breakdown eye-opening, make sure to hit that like button. It helps more people find the truth buried under all the noise. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We're not here to protect anyone's narrative. We're here to unpack what really happens when power meets secrecy. Stay tuned because this story is far from over.